meeting of Luncheon with Books and Friends of the Library, and thank you, Grace, for that beautiful music, and we want to thank Chloe for being our hostess today. I don't think any of us are going to go away starving. We a nice array of food back there. Now, if you'll stand, we'll do the Pledge of Allegiance. Attention, salute, pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Just one thing before I introduce Bethany. If you can see, we are beginning our pews collecting campaign, and they are $20. Jane, well, I just want people to know happy to have Bethany Dalton with us today. I found this book. I'm not really sure where I saw this book, but anyway, it was, I thought such a good book. I read it, and then I thought that...
Chipper cow.
Are we done?
Yes, I'm sorry.
She got me in trouble.
Okay, over. And Bethany said she would like to do a book for us sometime, and so I thought, well, this would be a great book, Fly Girls. It's a really interesting book. I don't think it's about what the title may suggest, but it's a really interesting book, and she's going to do a great job. But let me tell you a little bit about Bethany that you may or may not know. She grew up in Natchez, and at the age of 17, she joined the U.S. Army Women's Army Corps. In July of 1977, the WAC program ended, and all female soldiers became regular Army soldiers. In October of 77, 2 days after turning 18, she arrived in Germany. She served 43 months in Charlie Company, the 172nd Maintenance Battalion, 3rd Armored Division. Maintenance Battalion, that's working on them. Bethany spent 7 years in the regular Army, and upon leaving, she joined the reserves and spent an additional 18 years, retiring in 2001. As a legal non-com for Chief Counsel of Joint Transportation Command at Scott Air Force Base, Illinois. She had duty in 9 states and 3 foreign countries. Bethany received a bachelor's degree from Mississippi College, and then she and her husband, Jack, moved to New Albany in 2000 and became part of the Northside Neighborhood Revitalization efforts, and they restored 7 homes in our neighborhood. She worked as a real estate paralegal for the New Albany Tourism as New Albany Tourism Director, and she and Jack own Mimi's Books, which many of you may remember. She's a member of First United Methodist Church and various clubs and organizations. She has 2 stepdaughters, 4 grandchildren, 2 dogs, Sam and Penny. But the most important thing of all, she's my neighbor. And I'm so happy to introduce Bethany and ask you to please welcome her.
Thank you. We mostly have women here today, and that's good because the name of this book is Fly Girls. It was written by Keith O'Brien, and he is from New Hampshire, excuse me. And he was an author. He wrote for NPR and PBS, and he decided that he would write some historical novels about things that people just didn't know. And so this one is about the women. It sounds like it might be about military women, but it is not. It's about the first women aviators and some of the things that they went through trying to just be allowed to fly. So it starts right after World War I. And after World War I, aviation was not well looked upon. Many people, the men that flew, it was scary, it was dangerous, they often crashed. And the airplane industry at that time decided that they needed to do something that would make it safer. They needed to, and not only that, they needed the public opinion to approve of what they were doing. They needed to have marketable heroes, something fun, something that would bring positive attention. So they decided that what they would do, they would have air shows and air races. And there were small independent shows, but the main show was the National Air Show, and it was equivalent at the time to the World Series. It was considered dangerous. They were often fatal. The media and many men said that the races were considered too risky for even discerning men, and definitely no place for women. The first major race was a challenge issued by a man named Raymond Ortigue, and it was in 1919. I'm going to read quite a few things in here because telling about it, I think you just can't do some of it justice. The letter started, "Gentlemen, the dare began in a public letter dated May the 22nd, 1919. As a stimulus to the courageous aviators, I desire to offer, through the auspices and regulations of the Aero Club of America, a prize of $25,000 to the first aviator of any allied country crossing the Atlantic in one flight from Paris to New York or New York to Paris. All other details are in your care." It was signed, "Yours very sincerely, Raymond Ortigue." The Ortigue Prize sparked fever and the aerial competitions that would come to consume Americans during the next decade. This challenge was about to start a race that would forever shrink the world, ending lives and launching careers, inspiring countless men to fly and encouraging a few women also. This flight, a former war pilot said, will be one of the greatest feats ever performed by an airplane if it succeeds. Many men took this challenge. They either crashed, they started in 1919, and they either crashed, they had mechanical difficulties, the weather, they turned back, and many of the people that tried to cross the Atlantic were never heard of again. But in 1927, one of the men taking the challenge was a 25-year-old airmail pilot from Minnesota named Charles Lindbergh. He was flying alone and he was flying light. He was only taking 5 sandwiches with him. And one of the reporters asked him, they said, "Why are you only taking 5? Is that enough?" He said, "5 will get me to Paris, and then I can eat there. And if I don't get to Paris, I won't need them." So, his plane, the Spirit of St. Louis, was built for him by wealthy Missouri investors. And they thought it was too small for it to succeed. It didn't have enough space for all the fuel they thought that he needed. The takeoff was neither the safest nor the best. Across the ocean, Lloyd's of London refused to place any odds on Lindbergh's success after his questionable takeoff. The famous insurance broker declared that the risk of failure was too great. The American public, weary of air disasters, was just as concerned. Desperate for news about Lindbergh, people jammed the switchboard at the New York Times with 10,000 phone calls that day alone. It was the highest volume the newspaper had recorded. While others observed moments of silence, praying for the American aviator. At a boxing match that night in Yankee Stadium, the fight MC asked the typically rowdy crowd if they would stand and honor Lindbergh, and 40,000 fight fans did just that, removing their hats and turning their faces to the night sky. When he touched down in Paris 33 hours later, nothing could hold the crowds surging forward to embrace him. Back home, crowds gathered from Times Square, New York, to Lindbergh's hometown of Little Falls, Minnesota, tossing their hats into the air. Factory whistles shrieked and church bells rang. Offices were closed and schools were canceled. Lindbergh was paraded through 4 cities on 2 continents. But realizing that this wasn't enough, that the people wanted more, a wealthy aviation enthusiast paid Lindbergh a small fortune, $50,000, to keep touring. After he had won the Ortigues Prize and everything that came with it, the book deals, movie offers, and lucrative sponsorships, and the adulation, Raymond Orberg said, "I feel a lot lighter." And a friend joked, by $25,000. And he said, "No, lighter in the heart." With Lindbergh's success, Ortiz felt as if a burden had been lifted. No one else would have to die trying to fly across the Atlantic to win his money. But Ortiz and others hadn't counted on female pilots because they would do it for free. In 1928, the first national air show was held in California at Mines Field, and it's what's known today as LAX. This show had 300,000 paid attendees, about that many more that were just in the surrounding area outside of the airfield that watched. And a total of $200,000 in cash and prizes was awarded. The first great transcontinental trophy was known as the Bendix Trophy, and women were not even considered to be allowed to participate because they could never beat a man. The great show was missing only one thing: women. For the most part, in 1928, women just watched. From the grandstand or from the overflow chairs that were borrowed from the church down the street to accommodate the masses. There were dancing girls to greet the crowds, model girls to sell the latest aviation styles, and attractive on display on the arms of hero pilots or next to the silver trophies they hoped to win. They just weren't in the air. But by 1926, a new generation of female pilots, mostly young, refused to live by the old rules and appeared bold and dangerous and became known as the Fly Girls. In this book, there are several that are mentioned, were pilots, but the book concentrates and focuses on 5. The first one is Ruth Elder. She was described as a charming housewife from Alabama. Florence Killensmith from Minnesota. Ruth Nichols, a daughter of a Wall Street wealth and wanting to make a name for herself. Louise McFetridge Thadden from Arkansas, who wanted a career, family, and fame. And Amelia Earhart, described as a lost soul, living with her mother on the outskirts of Boston, but desperately seeking a way out. In the decades to follow, the 1920s and 1930s, it was said only one of these 5 women would be remembered. But for a few years, before each of the women went missing in her own way, these female pilots captivated a nation, racing across the ocean or across the country, hoping to beat one another and longing to beat the men. At times, 100,000 people swarmed dusty airfields to watch them compete, darting through the sky in their colorful planes of robin's egg blue and pale orchid, scarlet red and gleaming white, purple and cream and cobalt and silver, and racing an impossible tale playing out in deadly sky in an unforgiving time. The first one that we're going to talk about is Ruth Elder. After Lindbergh's success, she was one of the first female flyers that appeared. In 1927, she was a native of Anniston, Alabama. She was young, pretty, and very flirtatious. She teamed up with a male pilot to fly across the Atlantic, and the plane's name was the American Girl. 32 hours after takeoff, they discovered they had an oil leak and knew they wouldn't make it. Later, they said that it was a miracle that they had spotted a Dutch oil tanker, because they were able to let them know they would drive by and drop out a note that would hopefully land aboard the ship, and told them that they were going to bail out and if they would rescue them. And shortly after they did bail out, the plane crashed. Even though she didn't make it to Europe, but she did fly 2,623 miles, the longest flight for a woman. She was honored because of this, and President Calvin Coolidge met her and greeted her personally when she was invited to go to Washington, D.C. days later. She was offered a Hollywood contract and was soon in California acting. Ruth continued to fly, but not as often as she would have liked. However, soon people began making fun of her, calling her a silly young girl and that flying was men's work. Most hurtful were the comments from prominent American women. They criticized her, to include the future First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, who called Elder's attempt very foolish. The woman who founded the League for Fostering Genius said that Elder showed courage, but that one fast typist did more for a community than a dozen elders ever would. The book is written chronologically, and I thought it would be a little confusing to go back and forth with the times as he talked about each of the women. So what I've done is I've done each woman by herself through the years. So that's why it will kind of overlap. No more movie deals, no more airplanes, no more standing around at the air races in a yellow beret, and no more reporters showering her with the attention, just mockery and criticism. Life got so hard for Elder that by 1950, she changed her name to hide from the world. She was now Susan Thackeray, wife of George Thackeray, her fifth husband, an artist and art dealer in San Diego. The pair lived in a nondescript home on a nondescript street, and Ruth, or Susan, was apparently miserable about it all. One night, she dipped across the Mexican border to Tijuana and returned home with a box full of sleeping pills. Chugging whiskey and grain alcohol, Elder, the once beloved American girl, the Miss America of aviation, downed 61 pills in capsules. Enough to kill a person, the local police reported, but luckily was discovered in time. Elder survived, but with her secret out, Mrs. Thackeray was far more interesting than anyone knew. Elder's marriage to the art dealer didn't last. She was soon divorced and called one of her previous husbands, Ralph King, a cameraman, to ask him a question. "Daddy," she said, "are you married again?" "No," he replied. "Can I come home?" "Yes," he told her. King later called it a real love story, a moment of peace at the end of a difficult life. Elder was finally happy, it seemed, and living with King in San Francisco, and content, maybe for the first time, just to be able to be herself. Ruth Elder, for better or worse, with her feet on the ground. Flying in the sky is nice, she said at the age of 73 in 1976, but the earth has so many more wonderful things in it to make people happy. At that point, Elder said she just wanted to enjoy those things, the cool Northern California summers, the long walks that she and King shared along the water, and the view of the sailboats floating on the bay. "We are living," she said, "a lovely life." Elder died in her sleep 15 months later, slipping away without any farewells. She had prepared for this moment at least, instructing her husband on how to handle her remains. Ruth Elder wished to be cremated and have her ashes scattered from a plane into the sea. The next young woman that is talked about is Florence Klingsmithen. And I think, for me, this was this was the saddest one. And to me, it marked a real dark point in our history. She was from rural Minnesota. She was 5'4", cute, and had curly blonde hair. In 1927, at the age of 21, she heard Charles Lindbergh speak on one of his tours, and she decided that if he could fly, she could too. She was the only female in a class of 400 at an electrical school. She worked her way up to a mechanic's apprentice by 1928 and was working on planes in a new airfield in Fargo, North Dakota. She talked one of the pilots into giving her lessons, but could not afford regular lessons, so she took the only job she could get in aviation, and that was of a stunt girl. By 1930, she had received her license, had acquired a plane, began flying stunts, and giving flying lessons and breaking records, both men and women's. In 1931, in an air show in Cleveland, Ohio, she won $4,300. In 1932, the races were still segregated, but she won the women's race and won the first ever Amelia Earhart Trophy. One reporter said that the men should be on guard for her because all she needed to beat them was a faster plane, but she was very talented. Florence was very popular across the country and was a media favorite. In 1933, at the National Air Races, they were in Chicago, and Florence entered a competition that was against men. It was the Phillips Trophy. And she was the first female to compete against them, and it was a pylon race where they would see who could race around the pylons fastest. And you had to be able to dip the wings a certain degree in order to do this. And going into the 8th lap, she was third, and they just could not believe how wonderful her flying was and how her curves and turns were. And they also she was very remarkable to everyone because being a mechanic, she did her own work on her airplane. On the day of the race, she was in 3rd place going into her 8th lap when the fabric on the right wing began to tear away. At that time, the planes were all wooden and they covered them in fabric. She knew she was in trouble and she began to fly away from the crowd. Because she was flying low, she knew she needed to gain altitude in order to fly high enough to jump out of the airplane. And she didn't want to be near the crowd because she knew the plane was going to crash and she would crash into the grandstands. Witnesses said that the right wing tore apart, and flying 200 miles an hour, the plane became a missile, and the plane dove nose first into the ground. The witnesses also said that the wing tearing away, and with her flying away from the crowd, that she did everything she could to prevent the crash and not injure anyone. But the air investigators did not like that answer. They had a hearing. Many at the hearing praised Klingon-Smith, her racing qualifications, her fine-tuned skills built up over the years of flying, and those beautiful turns that impressed the crowd during the Phillips Trophy race. One deputy sheriff testified, "The girl has had quite a bit of ability. She had a lot of experience." But the same deputy in the same breath wondered if Klingon-Smith had made a mistake. The shredded wing fabric, in his estimation, wasn't enough to cause the plane to crash. Maybe she was physically or mentally overwhelmed. Maybe she panicked. I believe that she possibly fainted and leaned forward into that there stick, the deputy speculated, throwing the plane into a dive. In this scenario, the plane wasn't to blame. It was called a GB. It was a fast plane, it was small, and it was one that the pilots would like to have been able to fly. She borrowed it from the man that built the plane, and it was very fast. The whole affair was quite possibly pilot error, an explanation that seemed to make sense to the coroner's investigators who questioned everything about Klingon-Smith, her limited experience with that particular plane, minimal knowledge of the plane, and even her body. The aeronautics branch of the U.S. Department of Commerce had strict physical standards that every pilot needed to meet to be licensed. An aviator had to have strong eyes, functioning eardrums, good balance, and a healthy heart. Unrepaired hair lips and stuttering speech could be a cause for disqualification, as could a history of asthma or pneumonia. In general, government inspectors found any imperfection, but especially troubling were disorders of the brain, phobias and worries, amnesia and insomnia. The successful candidates would be cheerful, stable, self-reliant, and aggressive, yet also modest, fond of people, sharp, and resourceful. They would be, as the government put it, they would not be, as the government put it, depressed or hypercritical, submissive or irritable. And they would not be menstruating when sitting in the cockpit at the controls of an airplane. All women, the rules noted in italics, should be cautioned that it is dangerous for them to fly within a period extending from 3 days prior or 3 days after the menstrual period. Questions. One of the men's question: was this pilot examined before these races as to her physical condition? The coroner asked. I do not believe that she was. I would not say positively no. You do not know that positively? No. He said, a doctor typically examined the pilots at the races only in one scenario: if they had been drinking the night before, or if they were hungover or still drunk. We pretty well know how the boys are conducting themselves. By this measure, he suggested there was no need to examine her, but by failing to do so, they had obviously missed something. Did any official or doctor there know that this woman was having her periods at this time? Monthly periods, the investigator asked. No, sir. The verdict in the end reflected the reality. It wasn't the plane's fault, but that she wasn't well, and that she lacked stamina, and that she had died due to her weakened condition, a condition she had known about prior to the race and disregarded. So the crash was her fault. Remember, she had been one of the favorites, most popular. They loved her. Officials shipped her body back by train to Minnesota, naked and wrapped in newspaper, inside a cheap casket, with her blonde hair unwashed and her clothes unaccounted for. An insult as far as the folks in Minnesota were concerned. She'd given her life for the show, a local mortician pointed out, and for her sacrifice, she got nothing, not even the most basic human respect. I've had hundreds of bodies shipped to me, the mortician said, and I've had thousands literally shipped. But never before and never again did he see another case like this one. This flying home after the race, a few days after she had crashed, but before her burial, 3 of the guests men that were at the air show disappeared in a green airship over Lake Michigan. It would be 5 days before their bodies washed ashore, and that fall, a government official in Washington wrote an internal memo warning that planes would continue to fly from the sky. They would crash into homes, businesses, and city streets, and in many cases resulting in damage to property and life. There was little that the authorities could do to prevent that from happening, but they could stop the women, and they would. They said the women don't belong in these races, and they were out. I want to read to you something that happened shortly thereafter. Just a comparison. They were having another race within the next year, and the man who built the GB plane, his name was Zanford Granville. He was flying it because he was going to race in the plane. But those coming to the races that Wednesday didn't get a chance to see Zanford Granville in his famous GB. On his way to New Orleans for the race, he was attempting to land in Spartanburg, South Carolina, when for reasons unknown, he lost control of his blue and yellow GB. He was flying roughly as high as Klingensmith had been at the time of her GB malfunction, about 70 feet off the ground. But no one questioned whether he should have bailed out, recovered, or saved the plane. The pioneering airman surely did everything he could before plowing his GB nose first into the ground, cleaving off the engine on impact and smashing his body inside the tiny cockpit pit. He was dead, with a list of injuries almost exactly like hers. A tough break, one man back in Springfield said. There is no comment we can make at a time like this. Another said another. At his burial that week near Boston, a squadron of small planes dived over the cemetery and scattered flowers on his grave. A fitting tribute that nearly ended with another funeral. One of the pilots in the aerial procession had to make a forced landing on a frozen pond because his engine sputtered. Luckily, the ice held. The third female aviator is Ruth Nichols. She was from Rye, New York. Her father was an investment banker on Wall Street, and so therefore she was in a very special class. She had wealth, pretty much was a daddy's girl, could do anything she wanted. She knew that her life would be on the social page, the society pages of the newspaper with her debut, then with her wedding, after her parents decided on who she was going to marry and when she was going to marry. But that is not what Ruth wanted. But it really didn't matter. But on her 18th birthday in 1919, there was a flyer that was giving air rides in Atlantic City, and her father took her there so she could fly. The pilot did everything he could to scare her and to impress her. It was an open cockpit plane. But instead, she was later quoted saying, "I felt as if my soul were completely freed from my earthly body." And a few months later, against her parents' wishes, she enrolled in Wellesley College. And she spent 2 years there, and after 2 years, her parents, she was 21, and her parents persuaded her to go with them to spend the winter in Miami, because the goal was for her to become a lady. However, at one of the junior league events that her mother had arranged, she met a flying instructor and she began taking lessons. He told her the lessons were expensive, but he didn't know that she came from great wealth and was able to afford them. In 1924, she did return to college and she graduated. She still wanted to please her parents. It was a great struggle for her. But there were also adventures that she wanted to pursue on her own, and she did. In 1927, Ruth was the first woman to get a seaplane pilot's license. And also in 1927, she was the second woman to ever receive a transport pilot's license. In 1931, she began flying and breaking not only other female pilots' records, but often her own. Also that year, in an attempt to cross the Atlantic, she crashed upon attempting to land in Canada on a runway that was too small for her plane. Everything about the trip had been researched, planned, except that her plane was too large for the landing strip in Canada. The media began claiming that she was only trying to satisfy her Lindbergh complex, that she was obsessed with the delusion that she was the woman Lindbergh. In 1935, she was asked by a male aviator if she wanted to be a co-pilot for a new airline that was being formed on the East Coast. It was a 28-passenger plane. In 1942, during World War II, she established Relief Wings, a humanitarian air service. Throughout her career, she flew thousands of hours, competed in and won many races. She crashed and recovered many times. However, after the war, and for the next 15 years or so, she was in and out of flying jobs, and then she could not find work of any kind. In September 1960, at the age of 59, Ruth Nichols committed suicide. The fourth lady, and I've kind of done these in reverse order about who was popular, who did kind of the most, was Louise McFetrin Thadden. She was from Bentonville, Arkansas. She was 5'8", had several years of college, was very well spoken, and had always been a tomboy. Her parents said they had wished for a boy, and that's why she was the way she was. She was a tomboy. In 1925, at the age of 19, she moved from Arkansas to Wichita, Kansas, and the only job she could find was selling coal, and she was a very good salesman. Her boss, named D.C. Warren, had several other businesses, and one of those businesses was, this is the name, Travel Air Airplane Manufacturing Company and Aerial Transport to All Points. Two of the men that were building planes there, one was, I just thought this was interesting, Walter Beach from Beechcraft and Clyde Cessna. So she worked there with these men. Soon Louise was approached about working for the company's new West Coast distributor. Warren thought with a young woman by his side, especially tall, blue-eyed, well-spoken, and with a sweet southern accent, reporters were surely to pay attention to Travel Air. But for Louise, she didn't mind because it was a chance of a lifetime. Most women in 1927 would never have the opportunity to not only learn the aviation business, but also to learn to fly. In 1927, she became the first manager of the Travel Air office in Oakland, California, and the first woman to ever hold that particular position. In 1928, there were roughly 29 million women in America, and less than a dozen had pilot's license on file with the Department of Commerce. There were some that flew, but as taken the test and registered pilots. Louise received America's 1,943rd flying license issued, and it was signed by Orville Wright. Also in 1928, she met her future husband, Herbert Thaden. He was German, and he designed planes, and he had the idea that the best plane would be those not made of wood, but made of metal. In October of 1928, she prepared to set the altitude record for a woman. Most pilots were flying under 5,000 feet, and the female record at the time was 17,000. I want to read you a little of this just because of the conditions in which she flew. You know, I think nowadays, so many of the things we hear, you know, it probably would not have ever happened if they had not been determined. In early December, after weeks of preparation, taking off from an airport in Oakland and climbing into the cool air above the bay in her open cockpit Travel Air, she planned to gain 800 feet per minute for the first 5 minutes, level off around 18,000 feet. After a little more than an hour and the climb again, 50 feet per minute this time, forcing her plane into short dives. When necessary, in order to ramp up more speed or go higher, she would do the short dives. Once aloft, she was almost too uncomfortable to think about anything. The fur-lined suit she was wearing was too warm for the low altitudes and not warm enough for the higher flying. The parachute straps cut into her shoulders, and the chute itself pushed her up in the seat. Sitting higher than usual, she had to be careful to keep her head down, or she'd catch bursts of ice-cold air in the face over the windshield. Meanwhile, her makeshift oxygen mask which she had to find on her own, and she got it from a local hospital, and they told her that it might work, it might not work, but she was determined she was going anyway. But the mask kept obstructing her vision. Still, with eyes darting between gauges, she revved the throttle and kept climbing, half sweating, half frozen, and rising higher into the fog. At 18,500 feet, it was 9 degrees outside. At 21,000 feet, it was 0, and at 25,400 feet, it was 6 below. She had the record. She was so high in the air that if the engine had died, she could have glided all the way to Sacramento or Stockton, and it was time to come down. In the days ahead, it had to be certified by the National Aeronautics Association, and they said that there was something wrong with her gauges, and she really didn't fly that high, but that she had only flown 20,000 feet, but it was still a record that she broke. When she came down, then she flew 4 months later, in March of 1929, and she claimed her second race. This time it was for endurance. She took off in Oakland carrying 1,200 pounds of gas, and she flew non-stop in the air over the city for 22 hours and 3 minutes, almost 5 hours longer than any female pilot had ever stayed at the controls of a plane. "Well, I made it," she said upon landing, "but gosh, I'm tired." Then she added another record to her resume: speed. Over a 2-mile stretch in the sky above Oakland, she hit 170 miles per hour in her travel air and set a sustained record of 156 miles per hour, faster than any other woman she had ever flown. She broke records, the women's records, but the men's records she did not. And in this, the author points out that she hadn't come anywhere close to threatening the men's records established almost exclusively by military pilots flying military planes, often with full military crews. In recent months, they had flown almost as high as Thaden, 128 hours longer with a crew of 5, and in one case, with an Italian war ace at the controls, 160 miles faster. Still, an advertisement that spring in the San Francisco Examiner described Thaden with 4 words: world's leading woman flyer. In 1935, she was hired by the Department of Commerce as an air marking pilot. And what that is, because there were no instruments with altitude, were able to tell you where you were, you either had to have a navigator that would have a handheld compass. What they did was they would find buildings, barns, factories that had roofs that were at least 20 feet wide and 100 feet long, and they would write the name of the nearest town on top of the building. That way, if someone was off course or they weren't sure where they were or where they needed to, the route they needed, they were able to find these buildings and get back on track. In 1936, she received a call from Olive Ann Beach, who was Warren Beach's wife, and by that time they were making the Beechcraft airplanes. And she wanted to offer her a spot in the Bendex race. And this particular race was a transcontinental race, and it was from California to Cleveland. And they had to go, it was whoever got there the fastest. And it wasn't like they were all up in the air racing. They did it by time. They counted the exact minute they left to the exact minute that they landed. The women had to stay overnight somewhere because they didn't have the endurance to fly straight through. And against all odds, she won that particular year. And it had also been offered that if she was the first female to win, that it was a $2,500 bonus to an already $10,000 prize. Disappointments, Thaden said with a sigh late in life. For the women pilots along the way, there were so many. The banishment, the discrimination, the snide remarks, and the insults. Thaden knew what the men thought of the women, and it was hard at times to keep going, to keep flying. It took dedication, she explained, and the courage to accept defeat after defeat after defeat. Ruth Nichols' suicide was for Thaden the hardest defeat of all. She could handle Earhart's disappearance and the violent plane crashes that had killed Florence Klingensmith and others. But when someone you love takes their own life, she said, it's different. She thought a lot about Nichols and about the other female pilots who struggled emotionally, mentally, and financially after their time in the sky was over. Never finding their footing on the ground, Thaden stayed in touch with many of them. But then Thaden, a prolific writer with motherly instincts, stayed in touch with just about everyone from the time of their air races. She and her husband stayed married until their death, and they had 2 children, a boy and a girl. And she died in 1979, just before her 74th birthday. Of course, I've saved Amelia Earhart to last because she's being the most famous of the pioneer women aviators. Amelia Earhart considered herself a nomad, having attended 6 high schools in 5 states before the age of 18. Throughout her 20s, she had various jobs. She was a tutor, a nurse's aide, a truck driver delivering sand and gravel, and briefly attended classes at Columbia University. She went a couple of times, but always had to leave school because of finances. She kept a scrapbook, and it was all newspaper cutouts about women that were achievers, and she used them as a motivational guide for herself. In 1929, at the age of 29, Amelia Earhart knew that her life was adrift. So she decided she had no choice but to register with the Women's Educational and Industrial Union. It was an employment agency that was run by women for women. She was 5'8", dark blonde hair, gray eyes, a strong voice, very direct and very dignified. Amelia embellished her application, and the application screener described her as an extremely interesting girl. Her application held many lies, but the one thing that was true was what they didn't believe, and that was the fact that she held a pilot's license.
She's trying to speak to you.
Yes, yes she is. Well, I can continue to tell you about this. She had held various jobs and continued to fly, and in 1930, she was asked if she wanted to fly the Atlantic. Not like the pilot that was going to make $20,000, or the mechanic that was going to make $5,000, but for free. That just being the first woman was all she needed. But if the attempt was successful, she would be the first woman to ever fly across the Atlantic, and she accepted, sitting on the floor, leaning against the auxiliary gas tanks, all the way across the Atlantic. Because of the successful flight, the newspapers called her the best-known girl in America, but she was not excited about the achievement because she said she was just baggage, like a sack of potatoes. She said she may be famous, but she was famous for doing absolutely nothing. George Putman was a New York publisher, and he encouraged her to write about her journey. She wrote about her trip across the Atlantic, and she soon began working for him. He got her many speaking engagements, And she also wrote articles for Cosmos magazine. Earhart, Hart, and Putman worked closely together, and soon the rumors about them spread. In early 1930, Putman's wife of 18 years filed for divorce. When asked if they would marry, the answer was always from Amelia, no. But in 1931, they did decide to marry. And I thought that this was very interesting. She had no bridal gown, no wedding party. She wore a brown suit over a tan blouse. Her mother did not want her to marry him because he was 10 years older than her and he was divorced. Even Earhart herself seemed only half in it, writing a letter to Putman just before the ceremony. Dear GPP, that was as romantic as she got. There are some things that should be writ before we are married, things we have talked over before, most of them. You must know again my reluctance to marry, my feeling that I thereby shatter chances in work which means so much to me. I feel the move just now as foolish as anything I could do. I know that there may be compensations, but I have no heart to look ahead. In our life together, I want you to understand I shall not hold you to the medieval code of faithfulness to me, nor shall I consider myself bound to you. If we can be honest, I think the difficulties which arise may be best avoided should you or I become interested deeply or in passing in anyone else. Please let us not interfere with each other's work or play, nor let the world see our private joys or our disagreements. In this connection, I may have to keep some place where I can go and be myself now and then, for I cannot guarantee to endure all times the confinement of even an attractive cage. I must exact a cruel promise, and this is you will let me go in a year if we find no happiness together. I will do my best in every way and give you that part of me you know and seem to want. She signed it simply A.E. The bride was keeping her name. After her marriage, she was the speaker for an event that was held at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City. And there were 3,000 women in attendance. And she told them that a woman's place was wherever her individual aptitude places her. And I loved this. And the work of a married couple should be split. She should taste the grind of earning a living, and he should learn the stupidity of housework. Yeah, I'm going to repeat that. Learn the stupidity of housework. I will say that I don't have that problem at my house. In 1932, Earhart and Putman were secretly planning for her to attempt a transatlantic trip on her own. And at 7:20 p.m. on May the 20th, exactly 5 years to the day since Lindbergh had taken off from New York to Paris, Earhart took off. She encountered icy weather and a fuel leak. She said she wished she hadn't known it, but once she knew it, she couldn't, there was nothing she could do but be aware of it because it was dripping down her neck, down her back. But after 14 hours, she landed in a farmer's field in Ireland. She said it wasn't Paris, but she had crossed the Atlantic. She was the 14th person to do so, the first woman, and only the second person to do it solo. In flying the ocean alone, Earhart had proven a point that each of them had been trying to make for years. Women belonged. They should belong. Even their harshest male critics had to agree now. The women deserved to be included in any air race, over any distance, at any speed, in any plane. This is the year, one organizer said, for women's suffrage in aviation. She still gave her talks across the country. It was called Flying for Fun. Just a couple more things I'd like to read. One ad said, "Make sure you come hear what Amelia Earhart has to say. It will be as interesting to men as to women, for Miss Earhart is an authority on aviation as well as an entertaining speaker and one of the most famous persons her sex has produced." But anyone who attended her talks knew one thing. They always knew exactly how she felt. She pointed out the hypocrisy of the system, and in this case, the aviation world and the reporters who covered it. When a man cracks up, no one pays any special attention. Oh, but when a girl does. It bothered Earhart, who had long ago developed a keen sense of justice. Women, Earhart argued now, had just as much reason to fly as men. Just as much ability, too, also, if they trained and got experience. Women, she said during a stop at Yale University, should be treated no differently from men. A pacifist even advocated that the government should make women eligible to be soldiers. They should be drafted, she argued, made to do the dirty work, the real fighting, instead of dressing up and parading up and down the streets. If nothing else, she said, it would discourage old male politicians from pushing the country into battle. They are the ones, she said, who start the wars. She still flew, and in 1935, she once again set a record by flying solo from Hawaii to California. In 1936, the president of Purdue University in Indiana hired her as a consultant, visiting professor for a new department that they had just created, and it was the Center for the Study of Careers for Women. In 1937, Amelia Earhart and navigator Fred Noonan departed Hawaii to fly around the world. For a month, she and Noonan seemed to prove the skeptics wrong. They traveled some 22,000 miles, jumping from Oakland to Miami, Brazil to Senegal, Sudan to India, Burma to Australia, and finally to Lae, New Guinea, overlooking the warm blue waters of the South Pacific. Next stop, Howland Island, 2,556 miles to the east. She was flying a Lockheed. She said, "Lockheed stands ready," she reported, "for the longest hop, weighted with gasoline and oil to capacity." She and Noonan took off from Lae at 10 a.m. on July the 2nd, barreling down a primitive runway carved into a jungle at the edge of the sea, and then rising into the sky above the waves inside their silver plane. Trips of late had been relatively short and easy for a flyer as experienced as Earhart. This one would last almost 20 hours